Okay, here you go. This is a long-winded question, and which could occupy the first hour, but it's called, Tell Me the Stories of Your Various Connections with Fells Point Over Time. I guess interesting stories, or how you're connected, or interpret it any way you want.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that long a story. I had been, of course, drifting down into Fells Point and spent time here over the years that I've lived in Baltimore, but never felt myself to be specifically a part of it. I never lived in Fells Point. I lived in the Midtown Belvedere district and then the lower part of Charles Village. But in the last few years, especially since Cammie and Ed Kane have become a part of Fells Point, I started to spend more and more time here with them. And then as Ed decided he had had enough of doing the Dawn's Early Light tours and asked me to do it, I got involved with the whole history of the Inner Harbor, of course, largely through Ed Kane and his enormous amount of knowledge of Baltimore history, and started focusing more and more on Fells Point as a costume character doing this bosun's mate character for the water taxi. And then when a couple of years or so ago, when Ellen had seen me do that costume character as a bosun's mate, she asked me if I would do a costume character for the Fells Point Society, which I did. At first I did Robert Long, but then we switched it to Edward Fell, and then I started telling the ghost stories. And then in the Fells Point Society's involvement with the Baltimore Immigration Project, they wanted to do a tour about immigration into Fells Point and the impact of immigration on Fells Point after the steamship era started in Locust Point after the Civil War. So I built a character from scratch to an extent based upon my grandfather, actually. And as a Ukrainian immigrant from the late 1880s, and talked about history of immigration and the impact thereof on Fells Point. So that's been going on for 2 or 3 years now, and I guess I've become highly visible around Fells Point because I'm the guy who inhabits the costumes that are so recognizable. And of course, myself, I've gotten fascinated by and involved with the history and the whole attitude, the ambience of Fells Point. Ed Kane had said in one interview that, and I've heard him say it at other times, that he always regarded Fells Point as not so much a geographical place as a state of mind. And I find that particularly appealing as a thought.
What are the parts of Fells Point's history that you find most important and interesting?
Well, the notion that it is the oldest continuously operating, still working waterfront community in the country really grabs my interest. We're not a fly preserved in amber. All that history is here, and yet it's still a living, changing, growing area. And that sort of idea of historical connections fascinates me. The sheer funky, rundown looking age of the place by American standards. And of course...
Not all stucco.
No, not all stucco, but there is form stone, you know. And no lawns, no bloody lawns. And I really like that, being around the square. There's something about just strolling around the square kind of gets to me. And as I said, mentioning back to what I referred to before, the whole idea of it being a focal point of immigration, I find fascinating. That really engages my interest. Yeah, yeah.
Any other points of history that you find important and interesting?
Well, I get a kick out of, not exactly history, but I get a kick out of telling the ghost stories. I really do, because obviously they're fanciful, mostly apocryphal of that, but the idea that they're all, at least the little stories I tell, hooked into the history of Fells Point, hooked into descriptions of Fells Point, is something that intrigues me. That's why I enjoy it so much.
How do you see Fells Point changing as it moves into the future?
Can you hold just a second? I want to avoid the telephone whenever possible.
We'll start again.
Right, well, you just asked him the question and he didn't start answering it, so you're fine.
Good.
Just give me like a little half a second. I moved your cigarette because your cigarette smoke was actually being on camera. Your cigarette smoke is allowed to be on camera, his is not.
I don't smoke a cigarette.
Or your smoke. Okay. Whose phone is that?
Guy over there.
Oh, okay.
Get him.
All right. Go
Okay.
ahead.
That's really just about an impossible question for me to answer. I simply don't know. How do you balance, and how will it be balanced, the notion of development, the desire for the administration of the city and state to build a tax base, still maintain the character of Fells Point? I mean, I've been running away, being a city dweller and an artist all my life, I've been running away just 2 steps ahead of gentrification for as long as I can remember. I don't know. I don't have a Tealic vision. I can't see that. My
Yes.
concern
You
is,
have a guess?
how did we get to where we are? And then let's understand this, what we need. Do I have a guess? I have fears. I have fears
Tell
that
me
will
about your
turn
fears.
into...
Tell me about your fears of what the scariest thing that could happen.
The scariest thing that's going to happen, it will become so well developed, and eventually there'll be casino gambling located on the eastern end of the harbor, that easy access to the water and easy access to the shoreline will be closed off to most people who could otherwise stroll through it and just enjoy the ambience. That's my worst case scenario. How that gets balanced against maintaining a sense of the past.
That could be coming too with the current administration the way it is right now.
Honey, when you ask a question, you need to ask the question, stop, and get out of the conversation, because if you overlap his answer, I can't use his answer.
I just thought of that when I was asking the question.
It's a good question. I mean, it's a good
He is asking
comment.
good questions. I like his questions.
No, that's a good comment. I think that ought to be it.
Okay, where were we?
Say it again.
What did I say?
About the current
Yeah,
administration.
does the current administration right now reflect that? I see it that it does, but tell me what you see as being around here for.
No, I think you're right. I think the mayor's primary concern is to build a tax base. And I think that his focus would be on development and still maintain some of the quality of Fells Point, rather than focusing on maintaining the quality of Fells Point and allowing a little development, if that makes sense. You know, it should be further away than I think the focus is. And I think there are a lot of interests looking to establish casino gambling. Slots, I'm afraid, will come in. That's a camel's nose under the tent. 3/4 of the revenue from casino gambling all over the country comes from slots anyway. So then hoteliers and developers will start to say, well, look, you've already got it, why not? And this will seal people off from a kind of, the word I used, ambience that makes Fells Point what it is.
Do you think it could be like another Atlantic City where you have the central core is all neat and polished and shiny and new and everybody wants to go there, and one block outside of the new is just devastatingly poor.
Well,
Run down, and you see that with Fells Point.
Yeah, and it's one of the problems that happens with tourist development everywhere. How do we balance that? The tourism is necessary. Building an income, having people come and spend their money maybe is necessary to the viability of the area. At the same time, it always seems to create the rundown and poor worker, low-income worker syndrome on the fringes. And Atlantic City, you mentioned, but it's also like that in other cities. They're complaining about that in New Orleans too. The same syndrome since they've had casino gambling. I don't know. I really don't know. How does one avoid it? I don't know. What is critical at the core is keeping a cadre of really concerned neighborhood people active. That becomes the necessity. And I don't know how many there are who really feel that way.
Do you see some type of balance? Do you think a balance or maybe something that can coexist? Say they have the gambling. Do you think we can still maintain the history, the preservation, the quaintness of all that is Fells Point, the working waterfront and all that, and the gambling? Or is it one or the other?
I don't think that that quality of Fells Pointness as such will last, will really sustain in the face of casino gambling resorts. I think that'll dwindle away, and there'll be a house here or there which will be preserved. I think it could be maintained if low-rise condos or an appropriate kind of hotel were built, but I think that if it also led to a gambling area and resort, I think we'll find the quality of Fells Point sustained only in a faux commercialized sort of way. You know.
The Disneyland of the East Coast.
Yeah, a minor version of that. I think real Fells Pointers will start to move out and dissipate, and the fringe will be, as you suggested before, a kind of low-income workers area, service workers.
How did you arrive? These are a couple of my questions. After the garbage truck goes by.
Well, you can go ahead and ask the questions, because I'm not going to use the question on
Okay.
that.
How did you arrive, and Jackie said you don't think of yourself this way, but just humor me. How did you arrive at Fells Point expert status? At what point did you get the reins to become, because there's 3 or 4 guys in this town, when they think of experts and knowledgeable guys and da-da-da-da-da, you're one of the guys that always comes up, you know, Heaney and you and Ed Kane and, you know, those people, they come up, you know. I said, well, here, along with other Fells Point notables. So when people think of the experts, like the grand old wise sages of Fells Point, you're one of the guys. Is there any time where you felt like, you know, hey, I'm one of those guys, or is it just you just live your life and all of a sudden you kind of just found yourself there, or it's something not you don't even want to admit to? There's 4 questions there, real quick.
Well, I don't know if it's a question of admitting to it. Actually, I mean, I'd love to be able to claim it in a way, because as far as I'm concerned, people who are really modest usually deserve to be. You know, I don't give good humble, but I cannot claim maven status. I mean, I really can't. What I know of Fells Point started by playing these living history characters. every actor, and I'm an experienced actor, knows what it means to build a backstory. In building a backstory for my characters, the backstory was the history of Fells Point. And then, of course, I had a great tutor, the late Ed Kane. And Ed and I were very close. Ed has a profound interest in history and historiography anyway, and particularly focused locally on Fells Point. And his love of Baltimore City, and especially his fascination with the harbor. So I had a tutor, and in that sense, although he didn't think of it as actively tutoring, you know, but in discussion. And that was all part of building the backstory. And then I look up and go, wow, somebody thinks I'm a Fells Point maven. Hey, I'm an actor who built a backstory. And in order to do that, I had to learn the history. And in order to learn history, I had to sort of feel the place, to use a, I guess, a dated word from the late 60s. I had to learn to grok it.
Okay, can you hold just a minute? They want to...
Yeah, you're a great interview. This is great.
Thank you. You're welcome. I'm sorry.
You don't remember that word, grok, do you?
Grok? No.
The science fiction writer Robert Heinlein wrote a book in the 60s called Stranger in a Strange Land.
Right.
And it became like the cult book, you know, or one of the cult
Question
books.
of science fiction. Remember the book River World, which is one of my favorites? Was that along the same time?
Yeah, I think so.
That's
think
great.
so.
They just had a movie out where I wanted to see how they did. It was horrible compared to what you imagined when you read the actual science fiction River World. That started me into science fiction. Now science fiction, of course, sucks, but some of the great writers that made you
Well, I
use your
think a lot of
imagination.
science fiction sort of went into this very techy.
Techie.
And
that
doesn't
science
interest me
fiction
much.
was like you could be there. I mean, you could really imagine yourself there. That's what I like about old English novels and stuff like that. Now it's like they spell it all out.
Did you ever
for you.
read A Canticle for Leibowitz?
No.
That's the best of them all.
Really?
That's great.
I
That's
read
absolutely
that
great.
years ago in school. Hey, honey, there's a couple things I'm interested in getting from him.
Yeah, I got one more question.
Well, here, just let me tell you, and you can work them in whatever order you
Yes,
want.
dear.
He gave me a description one time of the village and Fells Point and how, you have this working area that gets run down and the artists move in, I'd like to hear that.
How would you form that in the question?
Well, just tell him you want it. One of the problems with your questions is that he starts talking in the middle of the conversation because you don't ask him open-endedly. He's not having to restate, what he's thinking. So
Well, you can to bring that up, if I may suggest, I said before I've been trying to stay 2 steps ahead of gentrification my entire life. What did you mean by that?
Yeah. And the other thing is if you can just get him to talk more about what he sees as the essence of Fells.
I think my interview is great. I really view myself as the male Barbara Walters right now.
I'm not
Okay.
criticizing your interview,
Okay.
I'm just picking up on a couple
No, I think it
things
is
in my
because
I
life.
know,
got
but he
me
did
going.
a couple things he did that got out of it that were really good, especially when he talked about Disneyland. He didn't use the word Disneyland, but you can piece that together to form your own whatever. I don't
Yeah.
want to say Disney because that's going to get you don't want him to say that anyway, but he alluded to fake happy places.
But the way he's answering your questions, he has to get like 4 or 5 sentences in before it's a standalone.
Right. Well, I don't mind that. I hear him get
Okay.
into the thing without,
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Listen, taciturnity and terseness are not my strong points.
I know.
Okay.
Go ahead and go on. Whatever you want to say next, go.
But anyway.
Well, I want him to answer. I want him to talk about what did you say, Fells Point, and just talk about Fells Point and how the artists moved in, and kind of a really brief history of all that, how that happened.
Well, in that sense, Fells Point has, over the years, followed a pattern you see in other cities, Greenwich Village, and then the Lower East Side, which somehow became the East Village, Old Town in Chicago, North Beach in San Francisco, here in Baltimore, Fells Point. this is a pattern that develops in cities. There's some funky old neighborhood which is inexpensive, and so artists move in because one can afford the space needed. And artists start to attract again, a faux hip crowd, weekend estates, and eventually some of them decide to start moving in, prices go up, lofts get renovated, buildings get fancified, and artists find another old neighborhood. And what's left behind becomes an upscale, gentrified, kind of updated, romanticized past. And I've been dealing with this and being, as I said, a city dweller all my life. It's been one of the problems.
I'm going to introduce something I want to know just personally here. When you have gentrification, you run the, you talk about there's problems with gentrification and the artists move out, but without gentrification, you don't have a tax base.
Well, that.
So how do you see that?
Well, that becomes the balance point of the necessary tax base of gentrification, and how artists can afford an area. How do you balance that? Oh, wow. I mean, this is something city planners should be thinking about, as to the point of a city is density. The point of living in a city is variety and diversity within that density. Jane Jacobs has pointed that out. How do you balance this in a way that it simply doesn't drive the culture makers away by the culture vultures? And I don't know. I'm not a city planner, but it is something that we should be concerned with for the health of cities, and not depend entirely on what has been referred to as edge cities, you know, suburban sprawl that turns into cities. They managed to do this somehow in Western European cities. Why do we have so much trouble with it here? I think one of the problems is, one of our basic problems is the automobile. And we've got to do something about that. Most American cities completely neglect or only pay minimal service to the idea of effective transportation. So everything gets choked off by automobiles, and the most valuable areas downtown becomes parking garages.
That's the old thing why jazz always came out of New York, because you could go from one jazz club to the next and you could take public transportation. Here, you have to drive, find a parking spot. People aren't going to go through all that. Same thing here. If if they had better public transportation, you could get to Fells Point, get to downtown, all that stuff, and you wouldn't have to
go through
that big hassle that the car is just gripes my ass. It's like, well,
our deification of the automobile is self-destructive and strangulating, and our addiction to oil is kind of loony. We have these marvelous great cities, and we turn it over to cars. We should be doing something, well, the way London did recently, not allowing cars into the inner city, or maybe somebody could design a city car, or electric cars just for the city, or I don't know. But this becomes an important part of the problem. Every time somebody proposes, and I remember this from when I was active in the community association at the Midtown Belvedere area, when they were first proposing the high school for the arts there in the old Alcazar. And the first complaint that came out of people was parking spaces. oh, all these kids going to school, they will take up parking spaces. And I heard this here in Fells Point. The first concern people had was when they heard there were going to be development planning concerns for the Broadway Pier. Not how do we maintain our history, what do we do about parking spaces? It's kind of a lunatic orientation. And I think something has to be done about that. Public transportation, electric cars, jitney buses, like they have in Asian cities that I've been in, which supply that need. I don't really know how that can be planned. But
even the trolley car in San Francisco, I mean, something.
And the trolley car is not only useful, but it's actually become a tourist attraction.
Yeah.
As I said, Asian cities, you can get all over Manila, side streets and so forth, with these little jitney buses or small size, miniature size trolleys. And they work because there's so many of them, and it keeps the street clear of a lot of cars. What you said about New York becomes important because you do walk from one place to another, and the public transportation is there. I think that's one of the biggest problems cities have. Not only in terms of the flow of people, but also air quality. I mean, that's part of it. And I'm always fascinated by how people who make such an issue of, say, secondhand smoke, even out in the fresh air, seem to drive two great big cars, one of which is an SUV, you know.
But don't get near them with a cigarette.
Yeah. And that doesn't seem to bother them. I suppose their campaign against tobacco buys off that, you know, concern or guilt over a 10 gallon a mile SUV. But I think that's a major problem. And keeping people on the streets. Keeping people walking on the streets. That becomes critical. Maintaining the small businesses, going from store to store, neighborhood bars, coffee houses, all the things that make for a lively, active street. I think that's important. Now, you can't expect that in every street in the city, but you do want to see that in Midtown, in a harbor area, downtown, and especially here. This is a neighborhood made for walking. The streets are narrow. Houses are close together. It's got that very scent of history in the air. And it is such a boon to life to be able to walk down an old street, feel a connection between the now and the then, to the harbor, and just do some water watching for a while.
That's one of the things I can't think about LA or some of those cities. That does not exist there.
No, it does
not exist in any form whatsoever, and it drives me nuts. I'm there 4 or 5 days. I'm like, I miss that. I'm like, man, it's just sterile here. There's just nothing. You don't feel anything. I mean, it's the air. You've got it.
Yeah, you notice those areas where people are most anxious to retire to, like Phoenix or South Florida or Southern California, are usually areas that nature did not design well for people. It's almost as if nature did not intend people to live in the middle of a hurricane belt or a desert or that kind of aridity. Even the palm trees in Southern California had to be imported.
One of the few people I know that knows that fact. They're not inherent indigenous to Southern California.
No, they're not indigenous.
They're all brought in. Every palm tree there was brought in.
For
Hollywood.
immigrants for appearance.
That's right. What's the most memorable, and as an example, either shocking, heartwarming, whatever, event you've experienced since you've been living in Fells Point or visiting Fells Point? Maybe a few things that you remember is like, wow. I mean, even like Ed Kane's death was a, but that, whatever you think.
Gee, that's kind of hard to pin down, because some of the things that mattered most to me seem to be trivial. I guess it's also an actor's concern, is that there have been times when I've been in costume, telling a story about Fells Point, and I'm getting a really focused, interested attention from my audience right out on the streets. It's sort of wonderful, feeling like I'm performing this story, and my set is all at Fells Point, and I can feel it that way. Storytelling is, I think, critical. I think arguably, at least, the most important phrase in the English language is once upon a time. We live our lives by the stories we tell each other, tell ourselves, tell our children, and feeling Fells Point to be able to tell stories about it on those occasions when I've got that intensity of response. I remember...
This is funny too, just along those lines. I remember with my mom and dad, one of the best remembrances of my dad is things he did. It was like, oh, my dad said, or here's something my dad did, or here's a story he told me, or something he told me, an anecdote, like, don't do this because.
And we live our lives by that. And feeling it in Fells Point, Faulkner, when he got the Nobel Prize, one of his remarks was, the past is not dead. It's not even past. And I think one can feel that in this neighborhood. And of course, in terms of a specific memorable event, although an unhappy memory, was the memorial service for Ed Kane. Unhappy, we were close, and it was grievous to me to see him go. But the memorial service was, as had been mentioned there, a celebration of his life, not an oy vey kind of thing over his passing only. And the way the whole community seemed to turn out for it, and the way people who hardly knew each other except to pass on the street and nod good morning, or didn't know Ed very well, nevertheless were felt impacted upon by the nature of the ceremony and the kind of incidents of neighborhood bonding that memorial celebration afforded. And I found that to be memorable and important in this community.
Do you see, some of my own questions come to mind, I guess. Do you see, and I don't, you can interpret the word any way you want really, but do you see a replacement for Ed Kane or a young Ed or anybody that's going to, like they said about Elvis, who's going to fill his shoes, the old George Jones tune, but is there somebody that's going to step up to the plate?
Somebody will.
And
I don't know who.
Yeah, that's the good thing.
I don't know who, but somebody will,
Jacquie.
As has been said, cemeteries are filled with irreplaceable people.
Yeah.
There will be somebody. I don't know who. I can't foresee that. But leadership emerges, and somebody's influence will be felt. Yeah. It'll be different, but nobody's irreplaceable. Nobody. What is irreplaceable is the mood, the ambience, the very zeitgeist of Fells Point, and that's important to sustain. Keep that sense of a dynamic past as part of our present. That's what really is important. And hopefully there will be people who will be able to galvanize action amongst the citizenry to sustain that. Who? I don't know. I don't know. Somebody will. I hope. Fingers crossed.
Now, with you going out of the country and moving, will you miss Fells Point? How do you feel about that? What will you take with you out of Fells Point? So
Well,
you're going to be living in Spain, so all of a sudden, you know, what will you take with you as
I don't really know.
box?
I don't know. I won't be able to ask me that question 3 years from now, you know, or so. I mean, I've lived in several different cities, and usually in what had been very interesting neighborhoods until I couldn't afford them anymore. And I'm sure there's something of Chicago, something of LA's, a lot of New York, even Rochester still with me. So I don't know yet. You know, 3, 4 years from now, I'll start to realize what mattered most. No way for me to project that.
Take a guess. Any guess.
I really much enjoy just strolling back and forth on Thames Street, looking at directly into water, and knowing what I do know, the history of Fells Point, seeing with my third eye tall ships coming into Brown's Wharf, or what is now the Broadway Pier. It seems to me that kind of imaginative or fanciful memory will stay with me.
Do it. How you doing? Did you change
We're
tape?
at the last 5 minutes. I'm just going to run one tape.
Oh, okay. Any anecdotes or any words of wisdom for people moving into Fells Point or people already living in Fells Point? Things to watch out for. Just sage advice from somebody that's been here that, you know, for say like me, I've been here 10 years, but obviously with talking to you, you really know a lot more about it than I probably ever will, but give me some advice or give...
I don't know that I have anything particularly sage or wise to say. I would again just flash that back to quoting Faulkner, the past is not dead. It's not even past. And that hopefully that as younger people, as newer people will move into this area, they will become sensitive to, hopefully even suffused with, that sensibility of history that does permeate the place, and not be anxious to lose that. Hopefully they'll find that strolling down Thames Street is a much richer experience than looking for a parking place.
That could be the title of the entire Richard
Yeah, I like
Kirstel.
that.
Richard Kirstel.
See, I knew you had words of wisdom.
I told you,
I got
see?
some gems.
I got it. I brought it out of him. I took my shovel and dug out that.
Thank you.
Richard, you were hot.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Well, thank you, Richard, for enjoying this festival.
You know, when I was teaching, students used to have little informal contests on mimicking me. And they always thought I didn't know that. And I used to peek through the keyholes and watch them do it.
I did it right to your face.
I am Richard Kirstel.
I mean, you know, seriously, you know,
Well,
imitation
really-
is the flattery thing.
What really got to me was after I left teaching, and I went into acting,
What'd you teach?
and the first, huh?
What'd you teach?
Mostly at the Maryland Institute.
Oh, photography.
And after I left teaching and went into acting, you know, over the first few years, I'd run into former colleagues or former students who would ask me, "What are you doing now?" And when I told them I was acting, nobody was ever surprised. So I figured that I must have been one hell of a ham.
Put up with
when I
those
was
little
teaching.
bastards every day.
Good morning. Glad to see you.
All right, that's it. Richard, I'm going to unhook you.
Okay, thank you.
You've been on.
Will I get a chance to see it?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.